a very important webinar on India and Asian geopolitics. And the webinar is being addressed by Professor Shiv Shankar Menon, who is also now visiting professor at Ashoka University, a formal national security advisor to the government of India. Today's session, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be chaired by our chairman, EGROW Foundation, Dr. Arvind Venmani, who needs actually no introduction. He's been the ex Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He's been in the Planning Commission and also the Executive Director at International Monetary Fund, Washington. So now I hand you over to the chairman. He will be chairing the session, and thereafter we'll start the talk shortly. Over to you, Virmani sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mahendra. Let me start on a personal note before I give you some of the formal introduction. I first met Shiv Shankar Menon when I was visiting Pakistan. Actually, you were ambassador to or high commissioner to Pakistan, and I still remember. I mean, not the exact details, but sitting and discussing things with you. And what struck me really, and this is what we hope you will give our listeners today, was your integration of practical and pragmatic and data and issues with a conceptual framework. So that's really what we hope, and hopefully both in the talk and in the discussion, some of that will come out. And then, of course, since then you have been ambassador to China and foreign secretary. In fact, please keep your mute your mics, please, all the listeners.
All participants, request to you keep your mics off, please. Video is optional. You may or may not put your video. That's optional, but mics certainly to be off, please.
So, when you were finance secretary, I think we overlap. Most of that time, I was the chief economic advisor, but I don't recall too many. Not many official interactions. I guess the economists and national security and foreign policy people don't interact that much in government, unfortunately. But after you became, Mr. Menon became national security advisor in 2010 early. And of course, I left for my IMF assignment, but I remember every meeting, I think every time I got a chance, I used to drop in, and you were always very generous to give me an appointment. I remember that even when you were busy, you were always available. I used to come and have a chat with you on China and many other issues every time I visited India. Now, since Mr. Menon's retirement, of course, he has written 2 books, which I should first mention. One of these will probably form the basis of his talk. The first one was Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy. And the second one is India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past and Present. Since retirement, he has also been in many other, he's been a Fisher Family Fellow at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, Richard Wilhelm Fellow at MIT, and was chosen at the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2010. He is currently also chairman of the advisory board of the Institute of Chinese Studies and a member of the board of trustees of the International Crisis Group. I mention these because I've interacted with them. I still remember the head of the International Crisis Group, I think, meeting in Singapore, in the Singapore Forum, where we interacted. But with that, as Mahinder said, Mr. Menon is so well known that I don't really need to elaborate on that. So with that, over to you, Mr. Menon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Virmani and Colonel MP Singh. Thank you very much for asking me, and thank you for having me, for giving me this opportunity to speak about my book, India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present, which has just come out in April. I thought what I'd try and do is to spend maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, just describing the main themes of the book. And then maybe we could discuss whatever interests you out of this. why did I write this book? Because the book itself consists of two big parts. I mean, the first part, the past, is a sort of survey of India and Asia from independence onwards until now. Because for me, I am convinced that this is our home in Asia, and that Asian geopolitics has shaped our foreign policy. Now, it's most people, when they look at India's foreign policy, look at our relationship with big powers, with the US, with China, with Russia, with the EU. But I don't think we take an integrated view of where we are in our neighborhood and how our neighborhood has evolved. And so the first part of the book looks at that, at the Asian home in which we operated. And the second part, the present, is really a description of where we were, let's say in 2018, 2019, when the book was written, with a few additions last year, and where we might be going as a whole. Because why geopolitics, you'll ask me? Because traditionally, geopolitics only means the influence of geography on state practice or behavior, on how states choose to implement policy. But today, if you look at geopolitics, it means the big drivers of policy, the bigger things that influence states, not just geography, but history, resource endowment. And this, I mean, for the economists, I mean, this, I think, this brings a whole host of disciplines in. Demography, how that affects what states do. And so what I tried to do was to use that as a lens to look at how India made her policies. The survey part, I think, is familiar to everybody, even though I go into some detail. And what that suggested to me was that not just our history, but our geography, our demography, our resource endowment, they all suggest to me that India has done best when she is most connected to the world, when she is most engaged with the world. Why do I say that? I say that because if you look at our geography, we are the only subcontinent in the world, by the way. We are a peninsula at the center of the Indian Ocean world. And it is really those maritime parts of this peninsula which have been most connected with the world through history, and which have been the most stable, the most prosperous, the most advanced parts. I mean, the Cholas ruled for 13 centuries, unbroken. But we've been taught a version of history by the British, and unfortunately there are people today Indians who still believe it, that India has continuously been ruled by foreigners, that we were divided by religion and caste, and this was all ways of justifying their own rule, quite frankly. They periodized our history by religion, that India was always insular, was closed, was sea-blind, and this was necessary for a small group of people trying to rule a populous, prosperous, advanced country like India. And they succeeded. But they also sold us this myth. So for me, the basic drivers actually suggest that India needs to be out there engaged with the world. Why do I say this even today? Because you look at our resource endowment. I mean, over 80% of our imports are maintenance imports. We depend on the world for basics like energy, fertilizer, non-ferrous metals, coal we import today. It's moong dal, I mean, you name it. These are things we cannot do without. And the more advanced we get, the more industrialized we get, the more we are part of global supply and value chains. Look at the auto parts industry, for instance. These are global supply chains. And how do we pay for these things that we have to import? We have to get into export. So we are naturally part of the world. The years of the highest growth in the Indian economy were the years when we opened up. in 1991, about 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, that was all the way up to about 49.6% of GDP. That's almost half. If you add services, you add remittances, the external sector as a whole is more than half of our GDP. So I don't think most Indians quite realize this. So we have no choice but to be involved. But the fact is we had to evolve strategies which were very different from what we'd inherited. We might have been legally the successor to the Raj, but independent India was not. Partition had given us a hostile neighbor to our west and cut us off physically from land access to Central Asia to West Asia. The Chinese occupied Tibet in 1950, and for the first time in history, we had a border with Chinese troops on it. And a boundary which was disputed. We had no trouble with Tibet. We actually had understandings on treaty, custom, usage, and we knew where the boundary was. But once China came and disputed them, and of course, thirdly, the Royal Navy was withdrawn. And because the previous government of India under the Raj was responsible only for the land frontiers, we were basically sea blind. It took us a long time to realize our maritime heritage and how important the seas were to us. Today, over 93% of our trade actually comes and goes by sea. So we had to devise a strategy in a very complicated situation. Again, an unprecedented Cold War, bipolar world divided between the US and the Soviet Union. And we chose not to choose sides, not to be dragged into other people's quarrels automatically. We chose to be non-aligned. But as we kept saying, non-alignment doesn't mean neutrality. It means picking a stand on issues depending on our interest, which means we can choose one side once, the other side other times. We might choose neither if that suits us best. But we had no choice, given our condition, because 200 years of colonialism had reduced one of the world's most advanced and prosperous societies into one of the poorest, couldn't feed ourselves. I mean, literacy was something like 14% and 8% among women. Life expectancy was somewhere in the range of around 26 years. So obviously the priority for us was to transform India into a prosperous, secure, modern country where every Indian could achieve their full potential. And if the transformation of India is your main goal, then that's the purpose of your foreign policy, to make it possible to enable that transformation of India. And for that primary requirement, peace, that you need to be able to apply all your energy to building India up. So essentially what non-alignment became was an attempt to expand the area of peace. It worked in some cases, it didn't work in some cases. In some cases, we were realistic in how we went about it. In some cases, we weren't. I don't think that China policy was a great success. We tried very hard to coexist with China, but China was a rising nationalist power under Mao Zedong especially, and for a whole host of reasons, we ended up with 62. So there were parts of that policy which didn't work. But frankly, the book itself goes through a whole host of these, whether it's Pakistan policy, our relations with the US. The book also mentions missed opportunities. In 1956, Prime Minister Kishi came to Delhi, and actually, this is Abe's grandfather, and actually suggested to Nehru that, you know, Asia needed to integrate economically. This was post-war Asia. Korean War had just finished. War was going on in Vietnam, low-level civil war at that stage in 56. But he said we needed to develop ourselves industrially. We needed to advance, and Japan had already done that before the war. But we were going the other way. We were looking for self-reliance, import substitution, industrial policy resolution around the same time. And Kishi, however, found that in Southeast Asia, there were countries who were willing to do that. And this is understandable. Frankly, in 1950, when you look at India's condition, there's a very good economic argument also to be made for not getting sucked into a larger. But the real reason I think that Nehru was so reluctant to be part of Asian economic integration at that stage was because he saw it as a US-led effort to contain communism. And he saw it as choosing sides in the Cold War, choosing and starting with economics, but being integrated into the Western system against the Soviets and the Chinese. And he didn't think that was a very good way to build peace in the region. So I go through some of these missed opportunities. Same thing in the 70s, 80s, once ASEAN was formed, I think. But we had our own reasons, frankly, because of Afghanistan, because of Kampuchea, because of a whole host of other reasons. But the other part of the book, the much more serious part as far as I'm concerned, but also the much more speculative part, is the present, which describes the world we are in today and what we as India might do about it. And essentially, we are today in a world created by globalization and by the global financial crisis in 2008, which I see as a sort of watershed, a divider, because we had a Cold War from the time the Republic of India was born until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Bipolar system, two superpowers fighting among themselves. Once the Soviet Union vanished, you were then in a unipolar world. And it was a period when China was also totally internally engrossed. She'd just gone through Tiananmen in 1989, and there were leadership divisions and social tensions as a result of reform and opening up, which they were trying to sort out among themselves. They had to shoot their own people in the main square of their capital in 1989 June. So China was domestically involved. There was a unipolar moment in the world where the US was the sole superpower. And we therefore made a huge adjustment thanks to mainly Natsumera, who of course kept denying that he was adjusting policy. He kept saying, I'm just doing what Nehru did. But he transformed the relationship with the US, opened that up. He elevated, we had already recognized Israel a long time ago in 48, but he elevated that relationship to an embassy level relationship. He opened an office in Taiwan without arousing reactions from the Chinese. He signed a border peace and tranquility agreement with China, which said we will both respect the status quo, and basically we won't bother each other. We'll go off and do more important things, which in our case was internal reform, opening up the economy, and transforming our relationship with the sole superpower. And actually, what he started, Look East policy, it was almost 180-degree revamping of Indian foreign policy. But he kept denying that he had changed anything fundamental. I suppose it made it easier to sell it politically at home. But all this he did because we were in a new phase. But after the 2008 global financial crisis, frankly, China was convinced that she now was the power of the future, that the West was in terminal decline, led by the US. Of course, this didn't happen. If you look at the period since 2008, the US has not been in decline. Europe might be. If you look at relative global shares in GDP, from 1980 to roughly 2016 or so, the US share is roughly the same, between 25, 28% of global GDP. But India and China, I'm in PPP terms, if you look at India and China, our share has grown from what was originally together around 4% to now about 17%, almost, in fact, 25, 26%. And the biggest losers have been Europe, because their share has actually shrunk down. And today, if you look at the sources of growth in the world economy prior to COVID, most of them were outside the traditional industrial powers. The US still, but otherwise China accounted in 2019 for something like 30% of global growth. India was a major contributor. And even now, it's likely that as once we are past the pandemic, that that actually the major share of dynamism in the global economy will come from emerging economies and from the Asia Pacific region, as it were. What has happened, therefore, as a result of globalization is a shift in the balance of power. The center of gravity of global politics and of the economy is now here in Asia. And this is a simple calculation, just measure where economic activity was happening in the world in the 50s, early 60s. It was somewhere in mid-Atlantic. So it was basically in Europe and America. Now it's east of the Urals and moving east, further east, steadily east. And what globalization has done, therefore, is to shift the balance of power. You've seen the rise of China, but it's not only China. It's the rise of other countries like India, Korea, Indonesia. I mean, there's a whole host of other countries. Secondly, we now have pushback to this shift in the balance of power. And we see much more adversarial relations between China and the US. The established powers don't like the idea of other powers coming and taking over and running the world. They would much rather use their strengths and establish their position. So their argument is keep stability, don't change anything. But the rising powers want to have a say, whether it's India, whether it's China. All of us want to have a say in how the world is run. Globalization did one other strange, unpredicted, but now in retrospect, obvious result. It was a huge threat to identity throughout the world. Thanks to ICT, everybody has in the palm of his hand a phone which shows him what's happening throughout the world, other people's lifestyles. It can excite emotions. It makes aspirations. And that technology-driven disruption led to the rise of new authoritarian leadership, most of it nativist, stressing their national credentials, much more nationalist than before. So it's the opposite. Globalization is supposed to make this into one happy world. Instead, it aroused local passions because people felt threatened, felt their identity was threatened. And also globalization and those decades led to a huge shift in urbanization. Today, the world is basically more of the world's population lives in cities today than in villages. And the proportions are increasing steadily. So people have been pulled out of their traditional home, family, clan, village, familiar surroundings. And they're now in urban, anonymous surroundings, exposed to a whole host of new things. So you get the politics of emotion, you get a completely different authoritarian politics based on hyper-nationalism in many countries. And the best example of that is really China. So you now have an assertive China, hyper-nationalist, a rising power with real hard power, whether it's military. Economically, today, China is a global superpower. Militarily, she's still a regional power, a local power in Northeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, and obviously pressing on us as well. So the world is multipolar economically because there are several economic powers who are global economic powers, the EU, for instance, the US. But in military terms, the US is still the sole superpower. She's the only one who can project military power to any part of the earth when she wishes to, who has that ability to intervene around the globe. And politically, of course, it's thoroughly confused, as I said, with the rise of new authoritarians, with local politics getting more fragmented. And third thing that globalization did was to all the hotspots, flashpoints, are now live again. And most of them are in our region, are in Asia, whether it is the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea between China and Japan, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea, where there are multiple claimants, whether it is the India-China boundary, whether it is Chinese involvement in Myanmar, or in Nepalese politics, or whether it's Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are now talking to each other, or whether it's Israel and Iran, or whether it's Syria. I mean, wherever you look, Yemen, all these are live flashpoints today. And because of the rise of nationalism, of the sort of leaders that we have today, from Xi Jinping onwards, Trump was, I think, the last example of that, the most recent example of that. The chances of these flashpoints, of crises being handled diplomatically or through negotiation or peacefully, are much lower. Why? Because if you base your legitimacy on nationalism, on being strong, powerful leaders, it's much harder to do the give and take, the bargaining, the compromising that you require to settle things peacefully, to come to an agreement. For us in India, the result is also that the geopolitical significance of the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region has gone up tremendously. We were a sideshow during the Cold War. The main fault line was in Europe. The killing fields might have been in Asia, but the main fault line was between the Soviet Union and the US and Europe. Germany was partitioned. Today, the main fault line is here in Asia, between China and the US. The US is pushing back, trying to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor. That's been her policy from the Second World War. First, it was the Soviet Union, Cold War, then it was Japan in the 80s. Then the Japanese threat vanished when Japan went into stagflation. And now it's China. And the US is using the weapons that she knows, which is she is a military power, she has technology, she's using what she can. She's using her economic power where she can because she sees that as a Chinese advantage which needs to be done in. How do we cope with this situation where the world has become much tougher, much more uncertain? This is not the open, globalized world, globalizing world that we were used to, and that, at least for the late 80s, 90s, and the noughts, we could operate in, and operated in successfully. We did very well in those years. This is a time where, we can't do without the world. So we need to actually stay engaged, but we need to maintain strategic autonomy and concentrate on the things close at home. Strengthen ourselves first, increasing our material power, military, economic. But secondly, and what we do at home actually really matters. It greatly affects what we are able to do abroad. And it's very hard to talk to any foreigners and so on if you can't walk the walk at home. Secondly, we need to increase our engagement with Asia. And here I'm afraid I personally am worried because I think we're going the other way. We walked out of our CEP after 8 years of negotiation. I'm sure there are very good economic reasons, but in effect, we are telling the Southeast Asians and the rest of the world that we don't think we are competitive today, and we don't think we'll be competitive after 20 years, which is the adjustment period provided for in the RCEP itself. Now, that's not a statement you want to make because we have today, as a result of Look East, Act East, a much stronger defense, security, intelligence relationship with all these countries to our east, all the way to Japan, whether it's Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, Korea, Singapore. We have that relationship, but you can't walk on one leg. And these are countries for whom the economics of it is very important. So we need an economic leg. We need a foreign economic policy which also engages and actually makes us part of it. We have worked on balancing coalitions to handle our biggest concern, which is China. China is the biggest threat to us, and we can talk about that maybe in the question and answer. We all know what happened last year. because China is the only great power which opposes the rise of India. All the others welcome it. For whatever reasons, US might welcome it because they see it as a check on China, whatever, but they welcome it. But China doesn't see India's rise as being in her interest. She sees a competitor in her backyard, in what she thinks is her rightful area, what she seeks as primacy first in Asia, ultimately in the world. We have worked with others who share our concerns, whether it's Japan. The Quad is a good example of that. But most of these arrangements are maritime arrangements in the Indo-Pacific, in the open body of water from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of America. On the continent, we have a much more complicated problem. And we are the only Quad member, by the way, who has both a maritime and a continental security issue, and where China figures in both of them. So we, therefore, on the continent have to work with other partners, with Russia, with Iran, with other powers, even though that creates complications for us in our dealings with the US and the others. The US is a huge opportunity for us, frankly. So are other middle powers. So is the possibility of building a broader third world coalition, because they feel abandoned in this confused world between orders, and where, frankly, the great powers are so busy in their own games that they have very little time or energy for the others. But the strategy that all successful rising powers have followed in the past is to keep their heads down while they accumulate material power. And they accommodate the existing system for as long as they need to, play by the existing rules until you have sufficient power to change them. And that is a matter of judgment, when to make your move. Japan in the 30s and 40s made her move too early, didn't have enough power, and you saw what happened. Germany made her move twice, failed. China's made her move now. She's pushing with the BRI, with an outreach, and she's now actually quite, with her wolf warrior diplomacy, she's quite open about her ambition. Has she made her move too soon? My own sense is that it's not going to be a China-centered Asia, and the book argues this. It argues there are multiple possible futures. This is one of them, but I don't think it's the most likely. But maybe we can talk about China's trajectory and where we are going. So all in all, I would say that we have a few hard years ahead of us. There is no working world order. We saw that with COVID. What did WHO, G20, G7, anybody do to help you through COVID? A lot of talk, but there isn't very much actually done. So there is no international order or multilateral system which works anymore today. We are between orders. There is great power rivalry at a level which we have not known for many years. And there are flashpoints around us, and we are near the center of the problem. And therefore, we will get dragged into it. We will see other powers in the subcontinent getting involved in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. So we have a complicated life for a few years. But let's see. Somebody once said that pessimists are always right, optimists always win. So I'd rather win than be right. I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great tour de force. So before I turn, what I'm going to do is first I'm going to raise, I have 4 questions. You need not address all of them. They're kind of related and some not. And then I'll ask Mahindra if he has some questions, and then Suman and perhaps Dr. Vishen Das, and then open it up to other questions and answers. So let me start. The one question which comes up when I read different people, and given that you've been a scholar of China, is this difference in opinion that most people who are China experts in the world, I'm talking, not just India, used to give a lot of weight to the history of China, Confucianism and all this sort of thing. And I have kind of always held that 50, or 70 years of communism has really changed the people, the parties, the elites, everybody. So the first question was, what, in your view, as a scholar, is the weight of these two things? The second, sorry, please keep yourself on mute, everybody, because there's a lot of disturbance today. I don't know why. The second, I wrote two papers. I don't know, you probably, I may have sent you copies when I wrote them. One was something about a bipolar world, which was written in 2004. And I followed it up with another one. They were both clear papers on a tripolar world, which was 2005. They were one after the other. In 2 years, I wrote those. And in those projections, I anticipated the most difficult period for India as between 25 and 35. Given the developments, I think it's arrived perhaps 5 or 7 years before. If we put it at Doklam, then it's about 7 years earlier than I predicted. So, so the thing is, we are in a dangerous period, and the issue, and what I had anticipated at that time was that India would need the US. I think that my basic thrust of all the points I had made in that was that India needs the US during this very difficult period. So in that background, any specific comments you may have or perspective? The third is a more modern, well, let me give the simpler one first, which is slightly backward looking. It seems that every time there's a change of administration, like the current one, or the Democrats come in, we go back to this issue of US-Pakistan policy. And right now, I'm not sure. I'm still watching, for example, our foreign ministers in US. But the issue which I have is how important, to what extent it does or will you be given your personal knowledge of this issue, to what extent does US-Pakistan policy really matter to us? Obviously with focus on at this juncture or the future, not so much the past, but past is always present. And finally, the fourth issue is the current one, which is, I do believe, and again, I've gone on a limb on this at the end of 2019, I gave a talk, and there's nothing perfect about it, so you can very easily disagree with me, because I know that it's a very risky sort of issue, but I anticipate technological decoupling and partial economic decoupling going forward for the next 10 years, which includes, of course, the supply chain, supply chain, value chain diversification and decoupling, which is basically going to be a risk reduction strategy. And to kind of break the Chinese monopoly, it's very clear that, the positive side was, China is the factory of the world, but they're also the manufacturing monopolist. And we hate monopolists. Forget China. I mean, monopoly is a dangerous thing. We know that from economic history. So that will drive it. That we can't. The rest of the world cannot. India, the US, Australia, nobody. We cannot afford to have China as a monopoly manufacturing and manufacturing export part. So based on these, I anticipate what I said, your observations or whatever you would like to say. So those are the four issues. You're free to take up any one or more of those, and then I'll turn to Dr. Mohinder Pal for his question.
Shall I wait for the others or can I?
No, there are a lot of them. If you want to just address whatever.
May I just respond to this? I mean, because these are huge issues.
Yeah, I know.
But I'll be sure. How much effect does China's history have on, in the Chinese mind, a great deal? The Chinese tell themselves a version of history, but they have always, I teach this course of 4,000 years of Chinese politics, and for them, history is an instrument. It is something the state has always used and shaped. Each successive dynasty writes the history of the last dynasty. And this whole idea of the dynastic cycle, of how things work, that has deep effect on the Chinese psychology. And certainly on people like Mao Zedong, an autodidact who, much less so today, because as you rightly said, their thinking has been westernized. After all, Marxism is a Western philosophy, but also they've signed on to a form of state capitalism, which again is a whole new ideology with the rule of a Leninist party, a one-party state. So they're still in the process of trying to figure this out. They use history, but they keep rewriting that history. I mean, in 1982, they told you Mao Zedong was 70% good, 30% bad. They said Cultural Revolution was a disaster. Now they've produced another history of the Communist Party for the centenary this year, which says Cultural Revolution is wonderful. They've airbrushed all that was used to be Mao's mistakes, because you can't criticize the leader, because now you have a great leader again. So history matters, but it's the version of history they tell themselves. Before 92, they told a heroic version of their history. Mao Zedong said China has stood up. The Chinese people have defeated imperialism and feudalism. After 1992, they went back to an earlier story of victimhood, century of humiliation, that the world treated us badly. So it's almost as though it justifies their present bad behavior, right? The Japanese suddenly became an enemy again. It became much more directed to these people did us wrong, therefore we will take revenge. We should regain our place in the world. And that's a story of victimhood, which is a very different sort of version of their own history. So history matters, but it's the history they tell themselves, and it keeps changing, and it's still evolving. And so that's my answer. About, you're saying the dangerous decades, the difficult times, you're absolutely right. And I agree with you 100%. But I do think that COVID has accelerated all these trends. It's actually made them more and brought them forward in a sense. I won't go into the details. I mean, you're absolutely right. We do need the US more to cope with this. US is critical. And if we're going to transform India, the US is a critical partner. And from the imbalance is because for us, the US is very important for our own transformation. But the US sees us as important because of China. And the Chinese also see the US as a bigger factor in India-China relations than we do. We see India-China relations as sui generis almost. Of course, the US matters, but it's not driven by the US. But in the Chinese mind, so there's an asymmetry there which leads to confusion. US Pak policy, frankly, once the US pulls out of Afghanistan, Pak is going to face the music. I mean, it is Pakistan which is being Talibanized, not Afghanistan being Pakistanized. So, I mean, for me, I don't think that I think what the US says and does with Pakistan is going to matter less and less for us. I mean, that's an undiplomatic answer, but that I don't think should determine how we deal with the US or what we do. Technological decoupling, I'm not sure that I entirely agree with you. Because, the Democrats are much more exposed ever since Bill Clinton actually tied the Democrats to big business in the US. And especially to the technology businesses. Apple, 24% of their profits is out of China. You look at aerospace, Boeing, they can't survive without the China. Wall Street can't survive without Chinese money. So I'm not sure how far this decoupling will actually take place. There will be huge technological competition, and there will be attempts to, for the US to monopolize the commanding heights of technology. But I think a lot of those horses have already left the stable, whether it's in AI, in ICT certainly. So there are areas like quantum computing and so on where I think it's going to be very difficult to, so there will be competition, there will be attempts to set, and there will be 2 or 3 areas where they'll decouple. I mean, the internets are already decoupled. And you have completely different sets of standards today, for instance, in cyberspace. You have a European set, you have the US model, you have what China and Russia are pushing. But it's going to be a much more complicated thing than just a decoupling, I think, because they are still joined at the hip. And if Biden's priority is to make the middle class rich again, is to rebuild America, I don't think he can do that by decoupling with the US. I mean, there's a huge cost with China. I think there's a huge cost to that. So I'm not sure. The interesting part is that which is why I think they talk of a China plus one strategy rather than an actual move from China. And when you look at the American Chamber or you look at the US-China Trade Committee, you look at JBIC, the Japan JBIC, their survey of Japanese manufacturers, and very few of them actually say they're moving out of China. What they're trying to do is to build alternate resilience. And I think that's what they are trying to look for. So it's early days yet. Let's see where we end up at the end of this.
Right, very good. Yeah. So okay, next Suman, first Mohinder, and then Suman, if you want to come in after Mohinder, and then Dr. Vishen Das, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Menon, sir, that was a fantastic talk. I've got two questions, sir, maybe two comments from your side. First is about Chinese interference in CPEC as well as CMEC. So from both sides, they are moving towards south, pipeline, road, gas lines, and Gwadar linking Sitwe oil fields. So they are coming closer to us, choking us from both sides, and now with Sri Lanka coming in. Tibet holds a lot of weight here. Now, US has started supporting kind of this government in Tibet. Even 2 days back, there has been news in the Biden government. It was not expected, but is following Trump's line. So India has not made a stand. India was the first country to recognize Tibet, to pull out our postal services from Tibet in 1956. But now is the time, don't you feel that we should be also, kind of recognizing Tibet, giving that a place? Because the moment we do that, recognize Tibet as a separate country, I think this is going to pinch China quite a bit. So that is my first question. So the second one is a little unrelated to this, but I would like your views on how does India move ahead? India is, as far as the UN Security Council is concerned, it has been many years. We have a rightful place. We should get that. We are the largest democracy, maybe 1/7 of the world's population, a big contributor in all ways now, and reasonable economic power. But we are still far away from seeing ourselves in the UN Security Council. Where do you see the future? Also, these two questions from my side.
The way I see it, I judge most of these issues, whether we should recognize Tibet, should we seek a UN Security Council permanent seat, in terms of the outcomes they produce. I mean, not in terms of, oh, this is status, this is recognition. After all, I am a big country. Why don't people treat me with respect? You're a big country, whether they treat you with respect or not. You are what you are. And you don't need other people to give you certificates of who you are. And frankly, I think a UN Security Council seat, and this is why I'm a minority, I know, I think that's a useless thing. It's a beauty contest. You need the votes of 5 permanent members and of 128 members of the General Assembly, other member states. And for that, if you want to be elected by them to the seat, you've seen how useless the UN Security Council has become, how useless the UN has become. What is the multilateral? Have you taken anything that matters to you to the multilateral system since Kashmir? And you know how it works. So why do you want to be on this? For me, this shows some kind of inferiority complex, that you want other people to recognize you as important. I mean, why are we bothered with this? It's a complete waste of time from my point of view. But as I said, I am a minority here. I know. And I know that for most people, foreign policy is about this, about being grand, about being recognized, about status, about hierarchy. For me, it's about power. It's about outcomes on the ground. And being on the UN Security Council is not going to feed any more Indians do anything for us or improve our security or our prosperity. Tibet recognition, same problem. As Panditji said quite clearly in 1951, the trouble with Tibet as an issue is everybody uses it as a stick to beat the Chinese with. But nobody is interested in the Tibetans. Nobody is interested in actually helping them. Who's helped them more than us? Nobody. And the Dalai Lama says so in public over and over again. I mean, the new Sikyong, just elected, said exactly the same when he talked of his relationship with India. You can, yes, recognizing Tibet, the Chinese will get very upset, very angry. Wonderful, you've tweaked your nose at them. Then what? Do you have a realistic chance of making Tibet independent? Do you think the world is ready to give up its stakes in China in order to recognize Tibet? No. You look at the process, it took you 5 years to get Bangladesh recognized by the rest of the world. When did they recognize it? When they saw the reality of what there was, and when it started affecting their interests. That's when they will. Today, to recognize Tibet, frankly, for my calculus, it's a gesture, and you can do it if you want to do gestures and annoy the Chinese, but you want an outcome. You have more serious issues to deal with. You have a situation on the border. You have Chinese pressure in your periphery. You have an economic relationship where you have huge dependencies on China, which you need to reduce. Do things about those. Do things which change deterrence on the border. Do things which actually generate counter leverage on China. There's no threat to China's hold on Tibet today. Let's face it. I mean, she has overwhelming presence and power. And even in 1950, you had no options. I mean, that's the chief told Nehru in writing that the best we can do is 1 battalion up to Gyanse, that's it. And we'll have to withdraw them after 2 months. We were busy fighting a war in Kashmir at the same time. So, you know, I think we need to be a little, for me, the test is always the outcome. What do you actually gain on the ground, or in terms of changing things in your favor, in terms of outcomes, rather than China and CPEC and CMEC. CMEC, you know, never underestimate the Burmese sense of their own independence. They have managed in a totally asymmetric situation to actually keep the Chinese dangling for years on end, and managed to extract political support from the Chinese, assistance from the Chinese, weapons, you name it. I mean, the Chinese have invested a lot in Myanmar.
And India too, sir.
India
And from
too,
India too.
but nowhere near comparable to what China has put into Myanmar.
Certainly.
But this is, for me, an example of if you owe the bank enough money, you own the bank. And this whole relationship, it's a much more complicated relationship. Pakistan also, you know, yes, they will say all these wonderful things about China, but there's a very interesting paper actually about how China, Pakistan have negotiated the CPEC and how many things the Chinese had to give in on to Pakistan, which just came out, I think, last week. I'll send you the reference later. So these are complicated relationships, and don't underestimate people's desire for independence from the Chinese. And therefore, I often think the Chinese have bitten off maybe more than they anticipated in the BRI. There are maybe 30–35% of those projects which make economic sense, which will go through, which will make money, will pay back, etc. But the rest of them, it's a cost to China, and it also arouses resistance. We don't need to tell people that they're getting into a debt trap. They know it. You tell them, it's like insulting them, saying, I think you're a fool, you don't even understand this. So you keep your mouth shut. They figure it out. After all, they bring in outsiders in South Asia because they're nervous of being totally dependent on you. You are preponderant. But that doesn't mean they want to jump into their arms and be suffocated there. So I think we need to work slowly and look at the longer term in things like this. CPEC, there are certainly huge implications for us, and we need to do whatever we can to counter this stake that it creates on the Chinese part to keep Indian territory under Pakistani control, because that's what it does in effect. And that's the part that really should bother us. And Gwadar, of course, has its own, because it has only strategic justification. So I mean, there's a whole, so for me, therefore, I would bring it back to the concrete. What do we do about it? Rather than telling people, oh, you're a fool, you've gotten into a debt trap, you're this, you're that. I don't think that's very sensible diplomacy. Then you'd be falling into the mistake that the Chinese are making now. Just today, I saw that Wang Yi is telling the Germans, how dare you say anything about Xinjiang? You, of all people, know about genocide. Now, this is, to my mind, this is stupid. It might be true, but it's not. If you want to get your way, this is not the way forward.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
thank you. So next, Suman and then Ashok.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes.
Firstly, Shankar, thank you so much. I mean, I'm a real groupie of yours because the amount of wisdom, insight, and judgment, one could replay this several times. Two quick questions. One, going back to your comment about what we do domestically. So I'm in the US at the moment, and the general judgment is that, look, India is like Argentina. It is innately protectionist. Okay? And yet, as you said earlier, that is not, as it were, the ideology. That's not our history. We believe in Shubh Labh. We have been globally engaged, a great trading nation. So can you illuminate what has made Indian industry protectionist, and also, as it were, what leadership might be needed, and it's apparently missing at this time, to counter these trends? So that's issue number one. And issue number two is, how much should one trust the Americans? Because after all, they are, as you've mentioned, a selfish nation, which is always concerned to make sure that challenges to their primacy are swatted off. What does that in turn imply for the texture of our relationship with China, given that we are both Asian powers? I have numerous other questions, but I'll leave space for others. And again, thank you.
Thanks, Suman. On this whole business of domestic, this industry being protectionist, I don't want to get into the economics of it. You know that much better than I do. But the reason I say we're the only subcontinent on Earth is because it gives you an idea of our basic dilemma. We are part of Asia, but we think we're unique, we're separate. We're a subcontinent, right? And we think we're a world unto ourselves. So we're torn between this idea of Indian exclusivity, that we can run our own affairs, that we don't need the rest of the world. And there's many people, the world will need us. There's many people in India who really believe that. I don't think they realize that half our GDP really is the external sector, or a little less now. But and this idea of Indian exclusivity, uniqueness, I think it maybe was necessary when we were building a national movement, when we were building national consciousness as part of a freedom movement. But I think by now we need to have a much clearer appreciation of our interests and our history and our geography and how that actually leads us to stay engaged with the world. So one reason why I wrote the book is to argue that you have to get out there and stay engaged and committed. You negotiate the terms as hard as you want, but you don't have today, in my mind, a foreign economic policy which matches the rest of your foreign and security policies. And that's a fundamental problem. I mean, industry will choose protectionism. It's much easier for them. I mean, I don't blame industry for this. I actually think that the Indian consumer is not empowered enough because, frankly, if you ask the Indian consumer, he knows where his interest is in getting higher quality and cheaper goods. And I think if we actually, and this is where the political system, because it is a system of trade-offs, and increasingly the politics is driven by money. Unfortunately, I don't think you get the kind of policy making, and this is not one government or another. I don't think you get policy making on the basis of national interest the way you might have done much earlier when you had less means. And so there is, I think, a fundamental problem in the policy process itself today, which leads to what you're saying, this idea that somehow protectionism, India is inward-looking, autarkic, that when we say self-reliance, we actually mean import substitution, you know. Can we trust the US? Yes, we can trust the US to follow their self-interest. So watch them carefully, study them carefully. I don't think their self-interest will change very rapidly because China is not going away tomorrow, day after. And that is their primary concern, how to deal with the Chinese challenge, which is why there's so much continuity between Obama and Trump and Biden in dealing with China. Actually, if you look at it, they might not be the more extreme forms of tariffs and so on, but in terms of containing China's rise, in terms of limiting it, I think basically American policy in terms of preventing the emergence of a peer competitor, I think, frankly, American policy has been fairly consistent. And I think that we can expect for several years to come. Unless you're positing China's collapse or vanishing from the stage, which I don't see in the near future, or you see an American collapse and so on. But again, I mean, we have to work with what we have, right? We extrapolate, we look at what we see. So I trust the Americans, but I trust them to follow their self-interest as they define them. And therefore, I would study them very carefully, no matter how close you get to them. And I think that's a mistake we made with the Soviet Union. We stopped studying the Soviets because we thought they were friends and we were so confident that we could trust them. And so for me, yes, but like any other power, I trust them to follow their interest.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think excellent point, that one, that you have to keep studying. Trust is a matter of knowledge. Very good point. Yeah. So, Ashok?
Yes. Yeah. Good evening. And Mr. Menon, you covered such a big ground, the depth and the width, absolutely top class stuff. And the concluding sentence of your main talk, I pick up from there. There are two questions basically. Like you said, you want to be winner rather than being right. And likewise, India as a country would like to be winner than the being right. Now, in that background, you touched about the RCEP also. Now, during last 6 years, from 2014 till we walked out of the RCEP, Indian ministers, both cabinet minister and minister of state among themselves, have visited each and every single country, 193 of the UN members. And how come that India could not convince even a single country out of those 15 countries in RCEP to walk along with it? When India walked out, no country out of those 15 countries joined India. That is mind-boggling. And in their policy circles, I had a chance to talk to the foreign secretary also, that consciously they are making bridges with all 193 countries who are the members of UN. Still, we could not convince them. So, to what extent this is a success or failure of our diplomacy? That is question one. Second, you talked about the Tiananmen Square tragedy also, whichever. I had a chance to read Mr. Vijay Gokhale's book on Tiananmen. Yes, Tiananmen Square, and from the view of the diplomatic, from his perspective. Now, even that book had 10 chapters, but he fell short of describing fully. And what prevents us to say, okay, now this is a chance, according to me, to challenge, because Chinese, they meddle in our affairs. Why we should not pay back in the same coin? Yes, now what you are doing, let us be more forthcoming. And he also mentioned Mr. Vijay Gokhale, because of the circumstances when he was in service, he could not raise the point. And at that time, on 4th June 1989, he was posted there in Beijing. Now, at that time, he could not say, I can understand his limitation. But as a country, what prevents us from calling a spade a spade?
Well, I think, frankly, I was with him in Beijing at that time. And we in the embassy called it what it was. I don't think we minced any words. I think in Delhi, and this is, don't forget, the middle of 1989, we're about to go into elections where, we're in Delhi, the attempt was, Rajiv Gandhi just visited 6 months ago, and we shouldn't jeopardize the results of that visit. And so I think Vijay Gokhale hints there that when we sent the families home saying, look, there are bullets going into our flats, and my children tell me that there was a bullet that went over my head. I have no consciousness or awareness of it, luckily. But they, at that time, Delhi said, how can you do that? It's like saying there's no faith in the Chinese system. And we said, yes, we have no faith in the Chinese system. They're shooting their people in the middle of the capital. What is this nonsense? So we sent them home anyway, the families, because we didn't want them in danger. No, I don't. But the interesting thing, I think, at that time, and I hope certainly now, is within MEA, we have a tradition of telling the truth to each other and arguing. We don't always agree among ourselves, but we argue. And in this, frankly, rank doesn't matter. Anybody can say anything to anybody on an issue, as long as it's policy, it's not ad hominem. But on Tiananmen, frankly, they were in enough trouble that we got what we wanted out of them, which is we got 25 years of peace on the border. But the trouble is they used those 25 years better than we did. And in those 25 years, their economy, which in 1980 was our size, was technologically at the same level of us, was less integrated with the world economy than us. In those 25 years, they became almost 4 times bigger than us, technologically much more advanced and much more integrated into the world economy. But we got what we wanted out of them. We got the 1993 agreement out of them because of Tiananmen, because they had such internal trouble. So we got them to maintain the status quo and basically keep the peace. But once the balance had shifted and all those pressures were gone, you saw what they did last year on the border. As for meddling in each other's affairs, all countries meddle in everybody's affairs, but they're never going to tell you. We will always tell you that we never meddle, but there isn't a border that we have not crossed in the last 70 years. And the Chinese will deny it also. So that's not, I think. RCEP, it's not a failure of diplomacy. It's a failure of policy conception. We didn't know what we wanted. Right through that process after 2011, I was still in government until 2014. But 2011, we started negotiations. We agreed to the negotiations. Every time the Japanese, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Singapore, Indonesia, they'd all come to us and say, what do you want out of RCEP? Tell us so we can shape the negotiation. We never had an answer. We only had negative statements to make. Other people made proposals. We say, no, this is wrong, that's wrong, this is wrong. But what do you want? We were never clear. At no stage. And partly it's the way we are structured. Because you have a commerce ministry who is not actually equipped to deal with foreign trade. It sees itself as representing Indian industry groups or associations, the Federation of Indian Export Industries, etc. But that's not the way for government to make policy. Government has to think for India, not for some federation or association or group of businessmen. And that's part of the problem.
Okay, that's very useful. Yeah, I mean, you've given me memories. There are lots of other questions. Please, no follow-up. So let me frame. I've just looked through the chat. I was hoping Mohinder will do it, but I've just seen it. So let me give you 2 or 3. One, there are a lot of participants from Nepal. I see.
Yes,
So
sir. Yes,
they
sir.
have questions
We can
relating to
give one or
India's policy with respect to Nepal, whatever you want to say in that framework. They're obviously interested in how India deals with Nepal. That's one set of questions. The second one is to do with ASEAN, which I found, and I'm reframing it. The question was on India as a gateway to ASEAN, but I think the interesting issue is the Northeast, Myanmar, the East-West highway, if it passes through, there was a East-Way highway, railway concepts we had 20, 30 years ago, etc. Something on that, if you want to comment, as Northeast as a hub and connectivity with ASEAN kind of a thing. And third was related to Sri Lanka. And again, I'm kind of reframing it. A question was quite relevant. The recent constitutional amendment, where they're allowing certain things to take place in that Hambantota port, which seemed to be extra territorial, maybe bordering on being a base like the US have. So if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, in Colombo port, actually. I think
Was it Colombo? Okay.
Yeah. Colombo. They're creating a Colombo, within the port, they're creating a SEZ, which they call a city. And the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, I think, said that, they need to change this because otherwise it becomes extraterritorial. They say they've changed it. I haven't seen the bill, the final bill. So I really don't know whether they've... So I don't want to comment on that specific thing. On the Northeast, Myanmar is a gateway to ASEAN. Yes, but I think part of it is, and this is also a problem in India-Nepal relations. Our domestic politics has complicated, and I mean both sides. I mean Nepalese domestic politics and Indian domestic politics have made it difficult for us to do the things that the bilateral relationship requires. On the Nepalese side, I think because of the internal turmoil for the last, now actually for years, I think relations with India have become a domestic political football. And today, that's the situation we're dealing with. So there are very few good choices for the government of India or the government of India's representatives until Nepal sorts its own mind out and makes up its mind actually on what kind of relationship they want. Privately, every Nepalese politician will say they want much better relations than there are now and so on. But frankly, when it comes to the systems interacting with each other, it's much harder. And simple example, the 1950 treaty. Every Nepalese politician in public says we want to change it. Every time we say we're ready to discuss it, and I've been through this process 3 times myself, we say we're ready to discuss it, come, let's sit at a table and talk about the changes. Nobody's ready to talk because he's nervous that his political opponents at home will stab him in the back and attack him. So you need domestic politics which can carry the relationship, and that is a problem on both sides. In the case of the Northeast, Myanmar, a lot of it is India's domestic politics intruding in the relationship. You saw what happened when Tatmadaw took over in Myanmar. The center says close the Mizoram border, and the locals say, how can we shut the border to our cousins and brothers, the Chin, because Mizos are Chin on the other side. And the border was kept open, and refugees were allowed to come in. Now, this is a political dysfunction on our side, which we need to sort out. And this is true of many of these issues. Increasingly, it's questions of migration, of an open border. Theoretically, we allow trade for border residents across a zone, across the border with Myanmar, for instance. But that's not the way I think policymakers think of that border anymore. So these are things which the political system has to sort out within itself, of how it's going to deal with these borders. Logically, with Bangladesh, it makes sense. We have the advantage of proximity. We should be opening up a whole host of border huts, for instance, and integrating the economies. Already, we exchange power. We've started inland water transport. We've done a huge set of things in the last 15 years together to try and improve the relationship, and we have a better relationship than probably we've ever had before. But again, it's our domestic politics and domestic politics on the other side, which need to be able to develop to the stage where they support what is obviously in our common interest. With Myanmar, you know, there's that 124 kilometers of railways that we have to join before we can run a train all the way from India all the way down to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And it's those east-west connections, the trilateral highway, which the Thais have apparently started working on their bit, which they had not done for a long time. Akyab or Sitwe and the inland water, most of that work is actually done, and it's a question of operationalizing it. But again, issues like the Rohingya, like the coup, the Tatmadaw, these things all get in the way. So we'll have to maneuver our own politics in each of our countries. It's never going to be easy. It's never going to be simple. But I think if you take the longer span, you take the last 5 years, the last 10 years, the last 20 years, at least on the Myanmar border with Bangladesh, I think we are heading in the right direction. With Nepal, I'm very nervous of where domestic politics and domestic political infighting is going to take India-Nepal relations. I'm much less nervous of popular relations between the two countries, but let's see. I do think we have an issue there that needs to be very, very carefully handled.
Thank you. Mahinder, have you seen any other questions which we've gone quite a bit of time? Were there any questions which you think
Yes,
are of general interest?
So basically, no, I think they have been answered, and other questions which have been asked have already been answered in the first this thing on India-US things. Yeah. So I think most of it has been taken.
India-US thing, sir.
Okay, no, but what is the question? See, we don't have much time. You have to be, brief.
Menon, sir, how do you see the Biden's decision to order probe?
To order?
Order what?
We've lost you.
Whether the virus
China. Wuhan, CIA, yeah.
Sorry, what's the question?
President Biden has asked the CIA to investigate the origin of the Wuhan virus.
Well, good luck to them. If the Chinese haven't eliminated the evidence by now, they are much more stupid than I ever thought they were.
Okay. Any other very brief question? No comment?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, please. The person with the hand, Vijay Kumar. Vijay Kumar?
It's hanging.
So Vijay Kumar, Mr. Vijay Kumar, can you hear? Yeah. You're not audible, sir.
Mute. You may be muted. Can't hear you.
Sir, may I ask a question? Dr. Ramesh, sir, am I audible?
Okay, Ramesh.
Sir, there is a general perception that due to its technological advancement and consequent economic strength, China plays a determining role in world affairs. Sir, how can it be explained from intellectual perspective? This is my question.
Well, I think that's an exaggeration. China plays a significant role in the world economy. But if you look at political issues around the world, for instance, when Israel and Hamas went through what they did last week, or most of these issues, China is frankly a spectator when it comes to political, because her actual political military power is limited. Even her soft power is not that, it's not as though the Chinese model is so attractive that everybody wants to be like China. Some leaders might like the idea of having total control of their societies and polity, but I don't think people as a whole are into chopsticks and noodles the way they are into blue jeans and Coca-Cola. So there is a problem there. I think we shouldn't overestimate China's power or influence in the world. She's very influential economically. But the question is the uses she puts that power to and what she chooses to use it for. China is still primarily a domestically focused power. And domestic stability is still, for China, the biggest preoccupation. She spends more on internal security than she does on national defense. That tells you something about the nature of how the leaders see their own society. And she's built a fantastic surveillance state. I mean, something that's never been seen in human history before. It's really a thing of wonder as long as you're not subject to it. So for me, therefore, I think to say that China is going to determine world affairs, she will intervene in world affairs to the extent that it affects her. But it's still an internally driven foreign policy. And much of what you see, all this wolf warrior stuff, I said, where they insult other people, which they're doing now across the world, where their ambassador tells Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, don't you dare join the Quad. Nobody asked them to. They never said they were going to. But you go and tell them, don't you dare. This kind of thing is not aimed at Sri Lanka and Bangladesh because it's not going to change their behavior. If anything, it'll create resistance. It's aimed at convincing the leadership that, look what a nationalist I am. Look how I stood up. Which to me, why do you have to prove to you are representing them? They've sent you out here. It suggests to me that domestic considerations drive this Chinese policy today to a much greater extent than for other great powers, and certainly not for superpowers who have determining effects or hegemonic superpowers or predominant superpowers or great powers. You don't see that kind of behavior from American or Japanese or other or Russian diplomats. You don't see that around the world. And I don't think that Indian diplomats have ever or will ever behave like that. So for me, that's really, I would put it differently. China wants to be the global superpower, no question. Lee Kuan Yew actually once, he was asked, so will China seek primacy? He said, obviously they will. With their history, the version that they tell themselves, they will seek primacy in Asia, certainly, ultimately the world. Good luck to them. But if they do achieve primacy, good luck to us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Great quote. So let me ask a final question because it's an area we haven't covered, which is important, and that is Russia. You mentioned Russia in passing, that we must know them well. One of the things which slightly puzzles me, because I'm not an expert on Russia, but as just a general observer, is the weight they are putting on short-term interests, where it's very clear, given the hostility of the US, their short-term interests seem to be with China right now. And as we all know, in the long term, it may be the opposite. So how would you see, and then a lot of people say that Russians are very strategically savvy, because they practice the art for years, ages and ages. So in that kind of perspective, what would you say, to kind of enlighten me or others who, want to think about this issue?
Well, Russia's problem, I mean, in our case, it's between insular and outgoing, right? Russia's dichotomy in history has been whether she thinks of herself as a Western power since Peter the Great. He's been trying to remake her into a European power, into a Western great power, Westernize Russia. Whereas the vast mass of Russia is in Asia. But the West, at least in the last few years, and some of us have been telling the Americans in the West now for 10 years, 15 years, Why are you pushing Russia into Chinese arms? You keep saying China is your biggest concern. Then why are you giving them a powerful ally like Russia by pushing them into their arms? I have no explanation, frankly, for 2 or 3 Western policies. Iran, Russia, these are not logical. If their primary concern is strategic rivalry with China, then what they're doing with these countries makes no sense. But that's what they've done. And so therefore, and for the Russians, it's a good fit. They have a market for their energy, and basically they are big exporters of raw materials and energy. That's what they survive on. And the Chinese need it. And they both sit on the Security Council with their vetoes, and they feel important. And it's very important domestically for the regime in Russia to be seen as a great power, that we haven't been reduced by the collapse of the Soviet Union to also RANs. And that is, to an extent, what China offers the Russians. More than just the economics and the support against the West and so on. But even that support, China doesn't always support the Russians on Middle Eastern issues, for instance, and doesn't really carry much weight there in the Middle East. For us, Russia is critical because we can't have a continental Asian policy without Russia, without Iran, as I said. These are countries, given the state of our relations with China and the likely adversarial course that they're going to follow over the next few years, it seems to me that these are countries that we will work with. China, Russia, Iran, and for the maritime domain, Japan and the US and the others, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea. This, to my mind, so we actually have a pretty complicated job ahead of us.
Thank you. That's great. I really enjoyed.
May I ask you
sorry.
a follow-up, please?
No, sorry. We have to close the thing. Thank you very much, or I'll leave it to Mohinder. If you want to continue further, but I was going to hand it over to you.
I think it's
we'll end the session here, sir. I'll just give them the sessions which are coming up. So may I take that, sir? Take them over to the session we are having at? Yeah. So firstly, thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Virmani sir, for chairing this session, and thank you very much, Menon sir, for such a detailed analysis of Asian geopolitics and for taking such a lot of questions. And now, ladies and gentlemen, just give you that this talk of sir will be uploaded to our website. Those of you joined in late can see that. It will be uploaded on YouTube as well as on our website. And secondly, the upcoming webinars of EGROW are as follows. On 31st May, we have with Professor Gopal Naik, IIM Bangalore, on Digital India, Telemedicine and Teleeducation. Then on 3rd June, we have a webinar by Professor Rakesh Datta from University, Defense and Strategic Studies, National Security Department. He'll be talking on national security, futuristic trends. And on 4th June, we have Professor Ben Friedman, Harvard University, on monetary policy. These are the forthcoming webinars. And on 18 June, we have Ambassador Manjeev Puri speaking on Nepal, exclusive session. So this is about the forthcoming events of EGROW. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. Anything from your side, Virmani sir? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you again, Shankar. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed that. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.